So welcome to the Fish and Wildlife fourth presentation as part of our Watershed Stewardship series. There is 5 total classes, and we highly encourage you, if you haven't attended or watched the other ones online, to go and check that out. Make sure to also fill out a survey for each of the presentations you watch, and if you fill out the survey for tonight's presentation, I have a couple of cool little brochures about pollinators and planting for salmon, how to be a salmon-friendly gardener. So if you fill out the survey for tonight, that should pop up on your screen after viewing it, or if you watch the web recording of this, then there should be a link down in the bottom for that survey, and fill out the survey to enter to win that. And if you fill out a survey for all 5 of our presentations, then you become an official Watershed Steward. So tonight, I am actually going to be presenting. I know that I have been the moderator for the last couple presentations, but I will be presenting this evening. And so there's the information about our other presentations and where you can find the presentations online if you have missed any of them. So my name is Ashley Smithers. I'm a resource specialist with Clark Conservation District. We work with landowners and community members to provide technical service, technical assistance, as well as put on a plethora of workshops like this one. We have a couple other ones that I'll probably refer to tonight that have been on amphibians, as well as one that's amphibians and turtles. So feel free to check those out if you haven't already. I have my Master's of Environmental Management from Portland State University. I like to say that I studied the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but really I studied urban turtle populations. And then I also have 2 papers that I published on amphibians, and I have done a plethora of work on pollinator habitat and different wildlife habitats. So that is me. So just to kind of put this whole thing in context, like, we as humans, we live with our wildlife. We are a big contributor to a lot of the habitat loss, unfortunately, that our different species encounter. So, you know, we have these urbanized areas, we build our houses, oftentimes that conflicts with wildlife. We also, another major threat to our wildlife is climate change. We have, you know, different shiftings of seasons, and that's impacting our pollinators because, you know, maybe they're starting to, flowers are starting to bloom a little bit earlier or later in the season, and so that sometimes gets out of sync with our native pollinators. Also, especially in the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot of issues around our snowpack, and that's impacting our river systems and when water is coming, when water is available, and the amounts of water that is available throughout the summer seasons, which is impacting like our salmon populations and mussels. Another thing that is a really big threat to wildlife is diseases. One thing that like I have studied with turtles is when you move different turtles around, they might have different diseases that they bring with them. In Washington, we have shell rot, and so if you have a turtle that has that and they are getting moved, then they might impact other ones. There's also like livestock or different exotic species that may bring in something new with them that's, you know, fine when they're in their native habitat, but as they come into this new region, they might bring something new that can impact our local wildlife. So those are just a couple of the things. One of the big ones is, you know, us, but that's, you know, that's okay. Like, I know that it kind of seems a little gloomy there, but you guys can help. No matter the size of your yard, you can join like the backyard habitat certification put on by Watershed Alliance and the Audubon Society. Or if you have like a larger acreage, you can do a lot of different things. And so tonight I'm going to just talk through a couple of different habitat features that you might have and what you can do to increase the amount of wildlife available. So with that, I want to do a quick poll just to kind of get an idea of the people that are joining us tonight. So I have Zora, who is my awesome moderator for this evening, and so she will put that up. And Zora, could you just let me know when about most people have filled it out?
Yes.
So I would love to know where you live. Like, are you in kind of an urban area or a rural area? Or maybe you just don't know, and that's okay. And then what types of habitats do you have on your property? Maybe you have a bunch of different types of habitat. Go ahead, if you have something else that you think is important that I don't have listed, please feel free to put that into the chat.
We have 8 out of 12 have voted.
Okay, we're gonna give your last couple people about 10 more seconds. So quickly try to get your answers in.
11 out of 12.
Okay, let's go ahead and, so can you share the results, Zora? Okay, so let's see. It's almost an even split. We have a few more urban people. It'd be great to hear if you are, what types of habitat you have. It looks like, you know, there's a couple of people one person that's in an apartment, another person, a lot of people actually have, about half of you guys have streams, which is awesome. And then, yeah, a good mix of everything else. So all of those things we're going to talk about tonight, and feel free to, you know, put that, any other things you might have into the chat. So what wildlife do we have around here? Some of the common things that people know, especially in urban areas, are raccoons. But you know, there's also things like shrews, weasels, butterflies. Yesterday I went on a walk and I saw so many butterflies around my neighborhood. I was so impressed. Salamanders, you can find salamanders in, you know, urban areas as well as some of the rural areas and in streams and ponds. And then, you know, you might have deer and elk and maybe even bats. Like, I was at my sister's backyard in her subdivision and she had bats hanging out, and, you know, that's really cool and awesome, especially if you're near a screen. So what other wildlife have you all seen in your backyard? Again, if you want to throw that into the chat, I'd love to see some of the cool things that you guys might have seen in your backyard. Doesn't look like I'm getting any responses. That's okay. If you guys, oh, here we go. Raccoons, squirrels, lots of birds. Oh, wow, somebody saw a coyote. That's awesome. Owls, so great. Yeah, so it seems like you guys are seeing a lot of awesome wildlife in your backyard. So birds are definitely one of the wildlife that I think gets a lot of people started with. Birds and pollinators seem to be the two that really get people excited and starting to think about wildlife in their backyards. It's really easy to put out like a little dish of water, a bird bath, or some seeds for your birds to play in. So there's a lot of cool books out there for being able to identify your birds. And there's a lot of really cool apps and online platforms for looking up birds and sharing birds and noting which birds you're seeing. So eBird is a really popular one. Here in Washington, we have the Washington Ornithological Society that has Reporting a Bird, and they really look for rare sightings. And then every year, if you don't know about it, the Great Backyard Bird Count is definitely something to check out. So tonight I'm going to be going through a couple different habitat types, and in each of these you're going to see a common theme. We're going to be talking about food that wildlife needs, water, and then cover. Cover is really important as well. So our first habitat tonight is forest land. A couple of common species that you can find are grouse, salamanders. There's upland salamanders, some black bear maybe up in the uplands and the mountains, and then some deer and bats. So lots of different wildlife that is associated with forest land. There's a couple of good things to think about when you have forest land and are wanting to have some wildlife benefits. You want to create multiple canopy layers. So what that means is having really like tall trees, medium trees, and then also having a shrub layer. And what that does is just allow for different species that will inhabit those different types of habitat. So you might have some birds and some squirrels and stuff that really like, being up in the tree areas. And then the shrubs and down below are really good for smaller critters to hide in. And then you also want to have a diversity of tree age, and that really comes in to just different sizes of trees. And then as trees mature and fall down, which is great, you want to leave them down. They can provide some awesome habitat there. But then it might create gaps, and then you have areas for different trees to grow. And maybe you don't just have one single age stand where it's all kind of uniform, but you have like a different sizes and different sizes, both like in how big the tree is as well as how tall they are. Another great thing to do is create snags. This is something that you can even do in the urban environment. So even if you don't have like a big forest, just having like a tree that if you don't need to like totally get down and like get rid of it and flatten the ground, but you're able to leave it, it's a great thing to do, because as the tree gets older, it'll decay, and that'll bring in different birds. Birds will use it for like nests, as well as like you might get some different bugs, insects that are using it, which will then attract more birds and maybe some salamanders and other things that will start using kind of that as it's breaking down. Down logs are also great. Obviously salamanders are my friend, so they're really great for that, and just again creates some as they do decompose, just create some good habitats for different critters. So then you also can create forest openings. As I mentioned before, you'll have different, trees might get old and fall down, but you can also create these like gaps. And what often happens, as you see in this picture, is that you'll get some different species with that, like the red flowering currant here, that will attract different pollinators or different bird species. Maybe you'll get some species like elderberry that has some good fruits on it that will attract some different bird species and will be in like more of a dense forest. And so just having that ability to have the different forest types is good. Obviously, if you don't have a huge land or huge property, you're gonna maybe want to pick and choose some of these things that you can do. You don't have to do them all. So another great thing that can even be done in a backyard, a small under 1 acre backyard habitat, is building a brush pile. And those are really great for like rabbits, you know, small mammals and reptiles and stuff like that. So those are really great. One of our kind of rarer ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest is our oak woodlands. And I'm also going to talk about our prairie systems that go along with oak woodlands. So our prairie systems, we have less than 3% of historic remaining prairies left in the Pacific Northwest. And so it's really, if you have these this woodland, which is, you know, you can notice it by our Oregon white oak or Gary oak. Both are the same. And also you'll have things like this little cute violet, the wood violet down here, or some trillium. So this is a really great ecosystem and very rare. So there's a couple things to note with it. They are associated with over 200 species. One of them is the western gray squirrel, which unfortunately, according to a recent study, that population may be extinct from western Washington, but the oaks do provide amazing habitat for so many different species, as well as they're an amazing cultural resource for us. A couple of the big risk factors associated with oaks are understory competition. So that could be things like your blackberries or tansy ragwort. These systems often are very open and sunny, and so it just, those types of things move in, especially because they historically were managed by Native Americans through continual burning. There's some other, with the lack of fire in a lot of these systems, you can still do some other things like mowing and other disturbances to try to keep that down, but that regular disturbance also leads to a lot of non-natives liking to come in and inhabit that. Another thing is that conifer encroachment. Doug fir actually kind of act like an invasive species in our prairie oak woodlands because they are moving in, and they will be shading out our oaks and becoming more dense of a forest with that lack of fire. Another thing is land conversion is a huge risk factor. These are open, especially when you look more towards prairies, which just means less trees, and more of the grasses and flowers. Then you have, that's just easier area to put a subdivision or a development. So before I move on to pasture land, are there a couple, like 1 or 2 questions or anything? Or should I continue?
There are no questions in either the question box or the chat. Feel free to put your questions in the question box or the chat if you would prefer.
Okay, well, I will continue on. So our next thing is pasture land. It's kind of a little like prairies with a lot of grasses, and these are a great place for a lot of cool things like voles, harriers, red-tailed hawks, pollinators, geese, and snakes and stuff like that. So they're going to be those more open areas, and so there's a couple of fun considerations that you should take into account if you do have pasture land. one of the things is avoiding early season mowing. And that has a lot to do with our little ground nesting birds, because they typically nest in our early springtime to about, well, like this July 15th, like, so we use that kind of as the mid-year time. And so by avoiding early mowing, you're allowing to have your grasses grow up. That's a lot of times when they're just, you know, right after winter coming out, and so growing up, and it's also allowing so that those birds, the ground nesting birds, can nest and we aren't disturbing those nests. Also, if you have a pasture, think about your pasture management and rotating your livestock that might be on there, and just maintaining that 3 to 5 inch stubble. That will, one, be really good for the vegetation in your pasture, so that, you know, your animals aren't getting all the way down to the mud and creating kind of muddy, and allows your grasses to continually to grow. But it also, by having it a little bit higher, allows for different wildlife to still be able to use that and have a little bit of cover, so from some of their predators like voles for a red-tailed hawk. But that being said, it's really good to install raptor perches. Sometimes we'll have some great trees on the edges of our pastures, but if we're noticing a lot of like voles or moles and different little rodents that might be using your pastures, by installing raptor perches just kind of helps bring those raptors into that area to help control that population. Also, leaving a little bit of unmowed areas is great. It helps with like deer and different, like, smaller rabbits and different things to be able to move through and have kind of a safety corridor through an area. But it also creates a nice buffer if you have like a stream or a wetland, to have that like unmowed vegetated area. You could even like put in a hedgerow or something that helps kind of filter out any pollutants from activities that might happen on your farm, like manure from your cows, or if you are spraying any pesticides. Another thing that people don't often think about is if you have a stock tank, or even you guys that might have a pond in your backyard, that you want to be able to have these escape routes. So sometimes you'll have like little critters like amphibians, or even like mice or something that might fall into it, and you know, maybe some of them you're like, oh, it's okay if that one dies, but in general, to make sure that you're not having an area that animals are dying in because they can't get out of them, because oftentimes with constructed ponds or stock tanks or even swimming pools, the edges are so steep and slippery that the critters can't get out, and so they get stuck in there, and then they're just swimming around and swimming around. So what's good to do is to put a ramp. But as we notice in like this one, you want to actually put material up to the edge of the like stock tank or pond, because what will happen is whatever the critter will get in, and they'll often hit the side, and then they'll just go around the edge of your pond or stock tank. And then if you just put a ramp in like this, they'll actually miss it and go under. But if you fill in that area between this edge and the ramp with something, then they'll hit that, and then they'll be able to scurry out. So I'm gonna get a little drink of water here. Do you have any questions? Okay.
No, I don't see anything.
So this one's a really popular one, a riparian, streams. It seemed like a couple of you might have had some streams, or about half of you did, which is awesome. So I'm gonna go over a couple of things you can do. Some of our wildlife associated with streams, you know, we all know about salmon. A lot of people talk about salmon and the things that we can do for that. A couple other things are like mussels. That one's, I think a species is becoming a little bit more popular due to a lot of awesome work by the Xerces Society. Which if you don't know, you should check them out. I have this awesome little book that, I don't think you can see it, but it's called Mussel Friendly Restoration that they put out. And they are just great because they really show a lot of how your water quality is doing, because they're amazing filters, and they have different little bugs and microorganisms that get in them that actually our salmon end up eating too. And so they're so important to it. Another cool underdog of sorts is our macroinvertebrates like stoneflies, mayflies, caddisflies. If you've ever, maybe as a kid or an adult, go out and flip over a stone in a river or creek, you'll see little bugs or little these little like casings, and so that's some of those caddisflies. This may look like a big pile of sticks up here, but it is actually a beaver dam that I encountered. So a couple of things that you can be doing in your streams is, and probably the easiest thing is shading your stream. So creating a buffer, planting the edges of your stream. We have an amazing, Clark Conservation District has an amazing book all about how to do streamside planting. So check that out. I will definitely include these, some of these links in the follow-up email. And then, so yeah, and the part of shading the stream is just keeping it cool. That's really important for our salmon species as well as mussels. And then one thing to think about with shading it is, you know, this time of year, I look outside and all these deciduous trees have their leaves and it's really shady. But in the winter time, when they lose their leaves, we really want to think about those conifers that are going to be providing that shade through the winter as well. And that's a lot of times like in the fall with fall chinook coming up and coho, when a lot of these species are coming into our streams. Another thing I like to say is texture, making sure to have some logs, having different size cobble rocks in your streams, different types of vegetation that's like along the edges, and that's just gonna kind of similar to the forest situation, just having those different types of habitat is gonna allow for different species to be able to coexist in a similar area, and it's going to be providing that cover for all of these species. If you have the ability to allow the, you know, floodplain to be connected, so when we have higher waters and you typically think of the stream as like, here's the stream bed, it's right here, but then when it's higher water, if you have the ability to, you know, have that floodplain area just that's, you know, kind of connected to the system is really good, and not like channelizing your stream. And all of those things just really help with making sure to like slow down the stream and allow some of the sediments to deposit and just create those varying different types of habitat within the stream. And again, I know that some of these things like you need an engineer to do, but it's just good to remember, like if you have a log that falls in your stream, like leave it there. If you have, you know, if you have a stream that has like a lot of reed canary grass or is just really open, start looking at what you can do to start planting that stream and shading it. So here's I'm gonna try to be quick on this part, but there is a couple other presentations that we've done about amphibians. So if you are like me and want to learn a lot more about what you can be doing for our amphibian friends, as I like to say, then check those webinars out on our website. But wetlands, as well as forests, all of those amphibians live in a lot of different places. So I just wanted to take a moment to kind of talk about some of our common amphibians in Clark County and what you can be doing for them. So these are a couple of our different species. A lot of people know the rough-skinned newt because of that beautiful yellowish orange underbelly. And they are poisonous, so just don't go and eat them and lick them. But they do have a mild toxicity. And then we also have a couple of really cool species like our Encentina and the western redback salamander. You can find a lot of those at Columbia Springs, and in our forested area. They spend their entire life in the terrestrial area. So they need big logs or just nice thick duff like understory layers to be able to be in. And then a lot of these other guys are in our pond system. So there's the American bullfrog, which is a non-native species from the southeast part of the United States. And it is right now, July, if you are out near a pond, wetland, and you hear this like low humming drone kind of a noise, then that's actually going to be our bullfrog, because all of our other species have already laid their eggs and are probably exiting the wetlands, and the bullfrogs are just starting to lay their eggs now. So here's a couple of things which I say for urban ponds, but like a lot of these also, you know, work for rural or any ponds. But one is thinking about the hydro period. As I mentioned, the bullfrogs are out right now laying their eggs, and so the reason that they can do that is because those ponds are wet. And so hydro period has to do with the length of time that the pond is wet. Bullfrogs, they take 2 years to metamorph, so they need a pond that is year-round wet. And while our native amphibians can also be in those ponds, oftentimes they can have a little bit more of an advantage in some of the ponds that are dried out by July. And so another thing is buffers. So ponds, a lot of the amphibians use, you know, they use the ponds for laying their eggs, for developing as tadpoles or larvae if they're salamanders. And then once they're adults, they're actually using the upland area. So oftentimes we're not thinking about their edges of their ponds and thinking about providing that cover right at the edge as well as a little ways out, and providing kind of a depth of layer so that they can go in there and protect themselves from like herrings and bullfrogs and some other predators that might try to get them. And then creating brush piles, you know, so that they can be in, and having vegetation both in the pond as well as around the pond. So another thing that's using a lot of our wetlands is turtles. You can find them in rivers and streams, a lot of slow moving rivers, and then our ponds. There's a couple of really awesome places like Ridgefield, Steigerwald, that you're able to see our native species, the western painted turtle. There are 2 native species in Washington, the western painted turtle, and the western pond turtle. The pond turtle is not found in Clark County. The nearest population is over in Skamania County. But we do also have 2 of our non-native species, the red-eared slider, which is often confused with the western painted turtle. You gotta look for that red ear, and also the bottom is yellow instead of this beautiful red color. And then also a common snapping turtle, which are ginormous turtles. If you want to learn more about these, check out that website. I have an entire webinar that I talk about these guys, or just let me know if you have a turtle or whatnot and want to discuss that more. So just remember, like, always build habitat and hopefully they will come. If you have a pond or are next to a slow moving river and you have maybe seen some turtles, some ways that you can improve their habitat is by creating some basking structures, putting out logs that they can bask in. That's an important part of their life cycle, or by having nesting area, which is going to have sparsely vegetated, sunny areas for females to nest in. If you ever do see a female nesting, leave her alone, let her do her thing, and then you can always contact a wildlife biologist if you want to report it. If you do notice that it is the red-eared slider or the snapping turtle, I would go ahead and mark that location somehow, and again let somebody know. There's the Washington Invasive Species Council, and you can report them there, and then let them know that you marked it, and then they can come out and get rid of that. But just remember, like with amphibians and turtles, you got to be thinking about the upland areas as well as the water areas. So a couple of herps, which are amphibians and reptiles, safe practices is limit your pesticide use, especially our amphibians. They have this porous skin that often, they are known as being kind of these environmental indicator species, because anything can go right through their skin, and so they are really impacted by pesticides, as well as fertilizer that can end up creating a lot of excessive growth of nutrients in ponds. Plant native plants, plant plants near the wetlands, on your edges of your wetlands, so that they have safe areas to escape to, or that turtles can kind of bask on the side of the wetland and have some cover from predators. Don't release your pets into the wild. Turtles last like 30 years, and so oftentimes people will, or some species more. So don't put them into the wetland. Find another home for them, and then create and keep connections between your upland and aquatic habitat. I'm going to do one little pause. Do we have any questions?
We do. How do I find out if our streams have any endangered species or invasive ones?
Okay, so there's a couple of different ways. I mean, some is just like if you can see them. Plant species, you can definitely contact like myself. I can help and come out and do a site visit to note some of that. There's also a couple of really cool mapping applications that you can find. WDFW has the Salmonscape, I think it is.
Yeah.
Salmon. Yeah, that you can find if it's a salmon thing. And then I actually, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to go over really quickly a really cool website that I helped put together that has some cool maps that show that, as well as the Clark County GIS maps online has some really cool layers that you can find out, like different salmon species and stuff like that. I don't know how widely available some of the other information is. So those are a couple of cool resources. I'm going to move on, Zora, and then we can do some more questions later, okay?
Yeah, I just put in a few links that will give some more maps that answer that question as well.
Cool. So oftentimes with urban wildlife, you know, that's something I studied a lot, and there is wildlife here. Like, you can create some really cool things and have, even if you have a small backyard, some great habitat. This is a great idea if you live in an apartment. You can get some little planter boxes and make some little pollinator gardens. So with that, I think this is like a really fun one, is pollinators and beneficial insects. So, you know, we all know what pollinators are. Beneficial insects might go, what? And so that's going to be things like, you know, some are like wasps, which seem a little scary, but they can actually, or like ladybugs that end up like essentially eating other bugs and acting as a pest control for other bugs, as well as sometimes for vegetation. They might eat your plants or help keep that. And so they're really important for your gardens and crop production, and then bees and different pollinators are as well. And you know, 75% of all flowering plants are needing pollinators. We have 35% of the crops worldwide use pollinators. You know, somebody said once that 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat in the US need pollinators, so they're really, really important. And, you know, we often think about like honeybees, but there are over, I think, 500 different species of bees in the state of Washington, which is insane. And there's some really cool things that you can do to attract pollinators. You can create little pollinator meadows with a diversity of plants. You can create these really cool little like nesting boxes, and these are for different solitary bees that actually will go in and like put one little egg and cover it up. Thing to know about these is that you really should, in the springtime, they will emerge, and at that point, if you're using these ones, you should remove them, or sometimes people will put little like straws in and remove the straws, and that's just important because there might be mites and other like pests in there that aren't good to keep in for the next year. And then another really cool one is this bumblebee nest area, and that's just because, you know, they're solitary and they'll actually go in to this little tube and then they'll be in here, and so that's just kind of a fun way, and so there's a little how to make it. So I feel like it's the theme of the night. Having diversity of different types of plants is really important. You want to have a diversity of colors as well as shapes and textures. That's really important for our pollinators, for beneficial insects. Having plants like, if you know the elderberry, that kind of has these bigger, thicker stems that kind of have this like opening, and then they'll actually be able to bore in there and like overwinter, and it creates some good habitat for them, as well as having that different bloom time and colors will attract different pollinators throughout the year. And then incorporate natives whenever possible. You know, that is especially important with, you know, certain species are reliant and very like closely associated with a specific native species. And so you, by having those species, those plant species available, you're actually going to be benefiting very specific species of pollinators, native pollinators. And then one thing that I like to check is making sure that when you get those like fun pollinator seed packets, that they're actually native seeds to your region, if that's what you're wanting, because sometimes they're not always native seeds and they're just kind of fun seeds. So, and while, you know, it's okay to have other species that aren't native, I think that just, especially for our native species, like having native plants will just help benefit those species even more. The Xerces Society is amazing. They have this entire chart. They have there's a couple different ones, but this is one of my favorites just because it's all laid out so well. But it will help guide you in those different bloom periods, so you can find plants that are early versus late. And then you can also know if they're an annual or perennial and be able to look at their colors, so that if you're creating a little pollinator patch in your backyard, you can kind of look at these and be able to know that you're getting a diversity of different species out there. And there's also, you know, your forb type species, and then your shrubs and trees that will help, you know, some of those beneficial pollinators. So, and then there's just a couple of general things to kind of close out the evening. Habitat enhancements around your home, controlling invasive species. You know, oftentimes they'll create this monoculture, and that just is not conducive for a lot of our species. One time with some blackberry, we actually found a bunch of salamanders that were using it, and we were able to just leave chop up the blackberry and leave the canes to mulch, and then it still provided that habitat while we were able to then come in and plant and stuff for the amphibians. But it's good to just have, again, that diversity and not just have your whole understory being English ivy. Also, when you're going back to plant those, then you're going to want to have some berries and nut producing trees and shrubs to just provide some of that food for birds and different critters. This is one of the easiest things you can do, is putting up a nest box. You can then see them year round. One of the things to remember is to occasionally go and clean out your nest box, because they'll get packed up, and then you'll have some different mites and different things that might get in there that won't necessarily be good for your birds. So once a year or so, go through and glove up and kind of clean out your nest box, obviously when there's not birds nesting in it. Another thing is you can check out the really awesome site BatCon for bat conservation, and they have some really great resources for how to build bat boxes. And these bat boxes are just simulating trees and kind of the bark that sheds off the tree a little bit that the bats are able to get up into. So one of the things with those is just don't make those bat boxes too wide. You really want them pretty narrow, because those bats like to get up in there and be nice and cozy so that they can keep warm. And then install or enhance water sources. That could be a pond. It could also just be like a bowl of water that's out there that, different birds can use. If you do just have like a little bird bath or bowl of water, do go through and kind of dump it out occasionally so that you're not, creating a mosquito breeding ground. And then avoid chemicals if possible, and if you do, just keep them localized by spot spraying. And then, you know, use native plants where you can. And then one of the other things is keep your kitties inside. They kill a lot of our birds. And there are a couple things you can do, like these funny collar that the kitty's wearing, which will actually deter. It kind of makes them so they can't run as fast to like get it, and then sometimes also they will get it so they can't like bite at the bird. So that helps deter it. But if you can, keep your kitties inside. They kill a lot of our birds. And with that, I am gonna wrap it up, but I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna switch it over to this. So Zora, if you wanna ask me a couple questions while I'm just switching my my screen over.
Yeah, we have 2 questions, one of which I'm going to give to you, and I'm going to take the other one.
Okay, good.
The first one is ivy considered invasive along a river?
Yes, so English ivy is from England, Europe, and it is and it's just, it like takes over, and if you've ever noticed, it's just like nothing else can grow there except for the ivy. And oftentimes people think like, oh, but it's working really well as an erosion control, especially around rivers or like steep banks. But actually that's misleading. It just is covering it up. It's kind of like this Band-Aid covering up the wound. And actually underneath, when you go and pull that ivy away, it has like taken back the hillside. So it is, yes.
And then the other question is, do wasps cause, and I'm taking this one, do wasps cause the puffballs from oak trees? Can they cause damage to our oak trees when we see these puffballs? So these are called galls, Galls, and they're very, very cool. If you look at the oak trees in our area, oftentimes you'll see these kind of weird tumor-looking things, and they're caused by little wasps laying their eggs in the oak tree. And these wasps, they don't sting, and they don't harm the oak tree for the most part. For occasional oak trees, if there's a really large infestation, they can harm the oak, but by and large, they don't. If you want to get rid of them, you can, but again, they're non-stinging wasps, so you don't need to worry about them being aggressive. And to get rid of them, you just prune out the branches, and you can burn them or put them in a bag. But I think they're really cool. I love seeing oak galls. I find them endlessly fascinating.
And do you know, Zora, hopefully I'm not ruining your thunder, but do you know the connection between oak galls and our Constitution?
No, I don't.
So the oak galls, they in it like produce ink, I guess, and so our Constitution was written with ink from that.
No way. That's really cool.
Yeah. So there's your fun trivia for the night.
Wow.
So to wrap up this evening, I just quickly wanted to go over, can you still see that, Zora,
the map?
Yeah, no, the website?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So this is a really cool website that Clark Conservation District, in partnership with the county and stormwater partners, put together. And we have talked, if you've been to some of the other presentations, we talked about, you know, where you can find Clark County's watersheds. But there's also this really cool section about fish and wildlife. And so this is a great resource if you just want to go and find some more information. It's kind of broken up similarly to how I did the presentation tonight. And you can go ahead and be like, hey, I have oaks. and it'll jump you right to it. And so then you can read all about the different species that are found associated with that, and then, yeah, with that type of habitat. And so this is just a really great resource. There's a lot of cool like maps as well as videos that are found throughout all of this. There's like,
we're not seeing any changes in this. I'm not sure if you're moving around.
can you see it now?
Okay, there it just switched.
Okay, okay. I guess I have two screens. Okay, so sorry about that. So it's just this fish and wildlife section. And then I was just showing that like you can just click here and jump right to a section, and you can just like pop out and see some of these cool images and read all about species. And then, you know, just explore some of these different tabs and learn all about different watersheds. And, you know, you can learn, and there's some cool videos and just different links of information in here. So check that out. And if you if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in all the emails that you have gotten when registering for this event. And then I can do a site visit with you, and we can answer some more of your questions. So with that, maybe I'll take one more question to finish out the evening. Do we have any more?
We do not. Well, we have
Okay.
one that was asking for the website address, but I put that up there.
Okay, excellent. So we will have a follow-up email with all of this information, and I'll include some of the links. If you want a copy of this presentation, or if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me, and make sure to fill out that survey. Either it'll pop up after this event or it'll be on our website. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful evening.